I'm Alyssa Gonzalez. I'm 33 years old, living in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Pronouns are she, her. I'm a professional science writer and a less professional pet owner and collector of vintage action figures, reader, gamer. Not a candlestick maker yet, but we'll see about that. I've had this ingrained mental concept of myself as this kind of pathetic, awkward person who's not able to function, was just either going to bumble through life or continuously embarrass herself. And it turns out once I've transitioned, that wasn't me anymore. Things started to make sense. I didn't have this gigantic weight of wrongness in my brain preventing me from even processing the information that was in front of me about how social situations work. Old, weird, deeply introverted, insecure, confused me was just living with such a deep sense of wrongness that she fundamentally did not believe in the possibility of her own happiness. And every time something nice seemed to come up, she'd find it and cling to it hard enough that it would slip through. And there's a lot about being autistic that people don't realize is actually a stress response to having to mask or process uncomfortable situations and so on. And so people that don't understand that about being autistic might say things like, I'm less autistic now that I've transitioned, which is not how autism works, but it can look that way. Because there's all sorts of unpleasant stuff that happens when autistic people are under stress that I don't deal with as much anymore because I don't have the stress of not being myself weighing on every waking moment. And I don't like using the word symptom there, because I don't think of my being autistic as a condition that has symptoms, if you will. The version of me that isn't autistic doesn't exist. That person's not me. That would be completely unrecognizable even past what being trans has meant to my past self. It's very difficult to maintain relationships when you're completely convinced that whichever person showed you kindness would be the last person to ever do that, and it would be an inexcusable offense against your own future to ever let them leave. It's not a recipe for healthy attachments. It's how you end up being the person where your date is 5 minutes late and you've already called her 15 times to figure out what's going on. And once I removed all the psychic baggage of trying to be something I absolutely was not, I got to see the person who was under there the whole time. Living a much more natural existence meant I could be open and self-assured and care what I looked like. And it turns out I'm hot, so that worked out pretty well. When I look back, I find signs deep into childhood that this kind of thing was coming my way, but it was not a possibility I could even acknowledge, and I'm not sure I was mentally able to recognize that my future was heading in this direction until I finally figured it out in late 2014, well into grad school. And that was an eye-opening moment when all the pieces finally came together and I realized what I would have to do. It was also a scary moment, that big changes always are. I constantly imagine just how much easier things would have been for me if I'd been able to figure myself out before I went through puberty the first time. Things turned out pretty well for me as it is, but they could have been better, and that was stolen from me by a world that did not permit me to so much as see myself, let alone embody myself at that young age. And the trans children of today have that possibility now. That has to be defended and guarded and expanded until trans women who figure themselves out later aren't the standard anymore. There's always going to be some of us that don't see ourselves until then, but those of us that figure ourselves out early deserve the chance that our modern technology has to act on that knowledge. We need the future to be as bright as it can possibly be. was a hell of a year, dealing with coming out and trying to resolve my permanent residence application and the last year of a grad school project that was not going particularly well, and a stalker at the same time. I finished my degree. I don't like looking at my old thesis at this point, but I'm proud of myself for having completed this difficult thing, even if it burned me out thoroughly on academia. One important thing that my transition did for me was remove a massive mental block that was between me and recognizing lots of other things about my situation. Once that obstacle between me and my own self-awareness was dealt with, and I could figure out that my relationship wasn't working, and ultimately ends that. So moving out on my own since then has been very, very good to me. I'd come to appreciate, and have since then come to appreciate even more, that my particular family is unusually conservative in a lot of ways, even for the conservatism that this background often implies. I was worried that they wouldn't pay for the last year of my tuition. I was worried that I'd be disowned and the things I had left behind would be disposed of. I was worried I would have to rebuild an entire sense of what family even is. And most of that ultimately did not come to pass, but there was a whole year where I was avoiding talking to my parents at all, to prove to them that they would either have to reconcile themselves to my reality or not have their eldest anymore. In between, I fielded a lot of letters from old friends in Miami and various family members telling me that how convinced they were that my ex had put me up to transitioning, like that's a thing a person can do, right? Eventually, honestly, I'm not convinced they thought it was real until I broke up with her. And then they noticed that the rest didn't change. They've gotten better at getting my name and pronouns right and so on, but I still catch them getting it wrong, and they still vote Republican because the well-being of their trans daughter is not as important to them as the fact that they're just wealthy enough to care about taxes, I guess. I have an extremely limited experience of the United States as a trans woman, I suppose. I mean, in some sense, I've been a trans woman my whole life, but I didn't have to confront the reality of my transness in the United States. The one thing I'm dealing with related to that is it is a tremendous pain to fix one's legal name in the United States, and it was trivial here, so I'm dealing with being dead named on some of my documents, but being in Canada was a breath of fresh air compared to the United States in so many ways, and the sheer nonchalance with which I get to exist as a trans woman is part of that. The same specific sort of Hispanic conservatism that has marred my relationship with my family is utterly pervasive in Miami, where I came from. It's in the air, and it's baked into the Spanish roof tiles, and it is the grass in every cul-de-sac. It is everywhere. It is inescapable down there, and it is one of the things I most resent about the place where I came from, and I don't have to deal with that up here. And that is amazing. I'm baffled whenever I encounter the idea that the United States is some uniquely advanced place, when most of what it's super advanced at is just new and creative methods of economic exploitation and inflicting suffering on the developing world. The real social progress is happening elsewhere. We will yet have a social democratic United States, if it doesn't burn itself to the ground first, and then it'll take credit for all the stuff that everyone else was doing before. But it's good for them when they finally get there. But Canada and a lot of Western Europe has been there for decades, and somehow the world hasn't collapsed. So Canada's what progress looks like on that front. There's much further left for all these countries to go, but it's embarrassing how the United States thinks it's the pinnacle when when the pinnacle is 3 or 4 tiers above Canada even. There's a lot about Miami I miss. Like, mostly the weather and the food, if we're being honest. And proximity to the ocean. But besides that, crossing the border up here for grad school is like time traveling 50 years into a utopian future, and I'm baffled that people are willing to make the trip in the other direction long term. As of this past August, I've been in Ottawa longer than I've been in any one other place. But it'll be a while yet before I've been there longer than I've been elsewhere. Center of my skill set is the fact that I'm a highly educated science professional who's also capable of stringing together a decent sentence, which is an apparently rare combination in sciences, because the premise of my niche is how uncommon that truly is. And so a lot of the assignments that I complete for my writing agency involve preparing blog posts for industries involved in the sciences that they use as part of their advertising. Sometimes I help scientists write their grant applications. Sometimes I write components of government documents related to the sciences. Just all sorts of things where the topic is science and the audience is not necessarily other scientists. Actually, being a scientist will prepare you mostly to write for other scientists, if it even does that much. But being a capable writer who is also a talented scientist it's a niche, and so far it's my dream job. I want to retire from this job. The fact that I'm trans doesn't come up unless I want it to. I've had more difficulty with being autistic, honestly, partly because I'm not diagnosed, and part of the reason for that is diagnosed autistic people don't get to immigrate to Canada because our system is deeply ableist. I like to imagine that all my colleagues are fully aware of my situation, and certainly my boss is, because she said to deal with some of the legal side of it. And sometimes I deal with puzzle piece imagery at work that I then have to contest, and that's been interesting. But being trans so far hasn't really been an issue. My understanding is that the Cuban government is a lot more LGBTQ friendly than the Cuban people at large are, and that's one of the things that is massively to the Cuban government's credit. I don't know how safe I'd feel there because I haven't done the research, but traveling on an American passport to Cuba is tricky, and it's not something I'm thinking about at the moment. Love to see that place someday. Would very much like to see Puerto Rico someday too. But vacation spot I have in mind is the Cook Islands, because it's cheaper than Tahiti. And I want to go on vacation in the South Pacific at some point. I think I'm well off enough that that's the kind of thing I get to think about now, which is an amazing feeling in itself after a year of being unemployed and another year of being just above a minimum wage, and a long time being a lot worse off than that. The South Pacific has intrigued me in a lot of ways. It's just so different from a lot of things I know more about, and it's warm. The world is improving for trans people, at least in the developed worlds, and a lot of the world is catching up to where it always should have been, but it's not going to get there on its own. So I feel like I've already otherwise built up the life that I want. I've got girlfriends that love me and that I love. I've got this cozy home that I can't imagine myself ever wanting more than this. I've arrived. It's just making sure I'm as comfortable as possible and weighing my desires against my ability to actually spend time doing stuff. Kind of looking forward to retirement to do a lot more PC gaming. I'm doing exactly what I want to do with my life, and it's the kind of job that I can keep doing well after retirement age, so I'm not too worried about that. Still saving lots of money though. Being trans brought a lot of my other life difficulties to a head. It is the single biggest source of drama with my conservative family, even past having politics well to the left of theirs and being an atheist where they're very Christian, and wanting to move up here when they define a lot of their identity by how proudly American they are. the thing immigrants just have to do sometimes, whether it's sincere or not. I think it is for them. The fact that I'm willing to date outside my specific ethnic background was a source of tension for them. The fact that I would consider a partner of mine having their full and unreserved approval to be a massive demerit that would cause me to not want to be with that partner anymore is certainly the subtextual thing they don't like. And so that was a scary thing. The fact that I was dealing with immigration at the same time as being trans was frightening, led to some complexities with my legal records that had to be resolved. Faced some complicated situations as part of my education, where it was hard to pin down how much of it might be related to being trans, or at least just being seen as a woman where I wasn't before. I'll never really know the truth there, but I got my degree, so the important part resolved itself. Early in my transition, I was a bit more visibly trans than I am now, and that got me some attention. Being trans is a scary thing in a lot of the world, and there's not a whole lot for those of us in the less scary parts to do about that, but it's something to be aware of. It's a thing to be aware of about other people's experiences. It's a thing to be on the lookout for when we confront it. More than anything, though, the process of figuring oneself out as a trans person is about embracing oneself in all the glittering possibility that means. And that means there isn't anything about oneself that one has to give up in order to embrace one's true gender. My expansive Beast Wars collection and my pets and all the mementos of my miscellaneous nerdery that are all over my home, and almost all of that is stuff I was doing before and have kept doing, because if I don't get to be myself as part of this journey, then what is the point? This isn't about ascending into some specific externally constructed vision of femininity, as much as I fit into some of those. It's about oneself. It's about embracing and continuing to be and embodying an even grander and more expansive version of what I am. Embody the version of yourself that feels right. You do not owe anyone a specific version of yourself.